This is a video on professions, professionalism, and professional ethics for the professional ethics class. This will help to explain what exactly we're talking about when we talk about professional ethics and what we mean when we're talking about professions and professionalism too. So what is a profession? One way that we could define a profession is that it's anything that somebody does for pay. Another way is a little bit more narrow. It's a job requiring some kind of skill or even specialized expertise. But the sense of a profession that we're going to be talking about is really a job that requires specialized expertise that provides a service that's unavailable otherwise. So notice that there's several parts to that, call it a definition of a profession, the sense of profession that we're talking about. It's not just any job. It's a job that requires specialized expertise, which means it's expertise that is not easy to attain. And it provides a service. It's not a matter of making something, manufacturing something. And that service is unavailable otherwise. So in common practice in the field called professional ethics, when they talk about professions, the professions have all of these following features. First and foremost, really the bedrock concept of a profession is that there is specialized expertise, typically developed through higher education. You don't gain it on the job. You gain it in part through organized, specialized education. Also, typically, professions require more than just a bachelor's degree. Secondly, professions have a commitment to use their expertise in service to the public good. That means that they primarily seek to serve the public and only secondarily gain something from that provision of service. In other words, the commitment to use the expertise for the public good is the primary aim of the professions. It may not mean that everybody who enters a profession does so because they want to serve the public. It's pretty common to think of people wanting to enter the field of law as doing it because it's a really well-earning kind of job. But the whole field of law, the whole profession of law has to provide a good to the public. Another factor in the definition of professional ethics, or a definition of profession that's relevant to professional ethics, is that professions have independence and self-regulation of their work. That means that at the level of the whole profession, the profession controls itself, determines what professionals in that field do, determines what counts as ethical and good work and what counts as unethical and poor work. There's an important distinction here between self-regulation of the work and regulation that comes from other places. For instance, a person can be an attorney and work for a specific firm. The firm might require that attorney to do certain things, but the self-regulation of the field of law is not the same thing. The self-regulation of the whole field is something like the American Bar Association's Code of Conduct. I'll talk about that a little bit further. Part of the idea of independence and self-regulation of work is that the professions have a monopoly over service. That means that they're the only people you can really go to have that service provided. Medical doctors, for instance, provide services that only medical doctors can provide. If you have a medical condition that requires certain kinds of treatment, only a medical doctor can provide that treatment to you. For instance, only a medical doctor can legally write a prescription for an approved drug that will help your medical condition. In addition, a profession usually has the following features: social status and prestige, salaried work rather than hourly work. In other words, their work is not measured by how many hours they work, which leads into the next idea. The salary symbolizes and pays for the expertise and status, not for hours worked. The reason that that salary is symbolic is because you're paying for the fact that they are the expert and only they are the experts. You don't have that knowledge. You can't get the benefit of that knowledge from any other source. Professions usually have a professional association. There are some where that's kind of hazy or even not really existent. But in general, professions have a professional association. One role that that professional association generally has is to establish a code of professional ethics. Now, notice it's a professional association, not a company that they work for. So, in my profession, there's not a professional association that all of us are members of, but there are standards of how professors ought to behave that are established and written about by, for instance, the American Association of University Professors. That group, which was started early in the 20th century, focuses on, for one thing, the way that professors ought to fulfill their jobs, how they ought to serve the public, and the ways they serve the public. So, professions have specialized service, typically developed through higher education, a commitment to use that expertise in service to the public good, independence and self-regulation of work, and a monopoly over service are the only ones you can go to for that kind of work. So let's look at some kinds of work and determine whether they're professions or not. First of all, a medical doctor. They meet all these criteria. Specialized service typically developed through higher education. Yes. If you don't have a medical degree, you ain't a doctor. And if you haven't passed board certification exams, you ain't a doctor. That's part of the self-regulation of their work, by the way. Do doctors have a commitment to use that expertise in service to the public good? Well, there might be a few doctors who don't really have that commitment or don't think about their work in terms of that commitment. And we might consider that certain kinds of doctors who have hazy reputations don't necessarily do things for the public good. But we're talking about the whole profession, medicine. And the whole profession of medicine absolutely has a commitment to use their expertise to serve the public good. Independence and self-regulation is a little bit, sorry about that, a little bit up in the air when it comes to doctors because of what we call managed care. Doctors used to have a great deal of independence and self-regulation of their work, but not as much anymore. Monopoly over service is something that's very important too. Lawyers are clearly also professions in meeting all of those criteria. Only a lawyer really is a lawyer. Nurses definitely have specialized expertise that they develop through higher education. They definitely have a commitment as the whole field of nursing to use their expertise in service to the public good, even though nurses often are understood in terms of working under the orders of a doctor, that isn't actually true. They have independence and they make their own decisions about how to do their nursing work. There are situations in which nurses are not just permitted, but required, obligated ethically to tell a doctor that it's the wrong thing to do if a doctor prescribes something that the nurse disagrees with. Nurses are really the only people who can be nurses. A K through 12 teacher. In a couple of states, ideas have been floated recently, and I think even laws have been passed recently that allow anybody who is qualified by having a degree, or even sometimes somebody who is a veteran, to bypass the need for specialized expertise and education and just jump into a classroom and be a teacher. K through 12 teachers have a problem when it comes to the public's perception, both of their monopoly over service and of their independence and self-regulation of their work. Nonetheless, I think we can distinguish K through 12 teachers who really meet qualifications for being members of that profession from those that don't. So I think K through 12 teachers still fit the definition of profession that's relevant for us. Some people that write about professional ethics don't agree with that. And some have a third category that they sometimes call paraprofessionals, meaning not quite professionals, for groups like teachers who may have some of the signs of a professional status, but not others. An accountant, well, if we're talking about a certified public accountant, absolutely, they are required to have specialized expertise, including passing board certification exams and a commitment to use that expertise in service to the public good. That's the job. If we're talking about accountant in the sense of somebody who's a bookkeeper, maybe not. In fact, people can be bookkeepers even without specialized expertise or a higher education. They can do the work perhaps, but that doesn't make those people the same as an accountant who has all of these professional qualifications. A police officer. Well, this is another difficult case. Do police officers require expertise developed through higher education? They go through a training process, but that training process isn't exactly the same as higher education. A lot of people go through criminal justice and other kinds of undergraduate programs before becoming police officers, but it isn't a requirement in general overall. So on the specialized expertise developed through higher education, police officers maybe are not quite a profession in the sense that we're talking about professions. Commitment to use that expertise in service to the public good, that's generally the claim that police officers as a profession make. Independence and self-regulation of work is another spot where police officers may not meet the standard of profession in the way we're talking about it, because to a certain extent, they do not have independence and self-regulation of their work. Their work is controlled and determined by political organizations, among other things, rules and regulations of the state. Some police departments have public oversight as established by court cases, rules of judges that a certain police department is required to have a public agency or a public group overseeing the work. And in that case, their work would lack independence and self-regulation in a certain way. Okay, a pro athlete. My example is an NBA player. Some people like to argue that this is a profession. They have specialized expertise. Only certain kinds of people can be a pro athlete, can be a pro basketball player. But Is that expertise developed through higher education? Even if most NBA players have been college basketball players, it's not the basketball that they are studying in higher education. They don't go to college and major in basketball, not at reputable colleges and universities anyway. Another question is whether they use their expertise in service to the public good. Well, is it really for the public's good? It's entertaining, but entertainment is not necessarily a public good. It doesn't necessarily serve everybody's needs. I'm not really a big fan of basketball, and I don't care a thing about the NBA personally. Nothing against it. I just don't care for it. Does that serve me in some way, even though I don't care for it? It didn't seem like it. One of the big problems with pro athletes is monopoly over service. Anybody can play basketball. Maybe not as well, but if basketball and basketball games and watching basketball games and playing basketball is your idea of fun, you can just do it. You don't have to be good at it to enjoy it. I used to like playing basketball when I was a kid. I was terrible, but I used to enjoy doing it. I would never say that I was a member of a profession. I skipped over independence and self regulation of work for pro athletes because I'd argue they don't have that at all. There are rules for the sports that they play, and they don't control those rules in any degree. They may have organizing strategies like unions that help them to take certain kinds of power away from the owners of their teams and allow them to negotiate, including negotiate over things about self-regulation, even negotiate over rules. But the rules are the rules, and they aren't determined exactly by the players themselves. It's just not a very good fit for our idea of professions. The reason pimp is on this list is that I had a student years ago who insisted on writing a paper talking about the professional ethics of being a pimp. It was an amusing paper to read, and the student was, the student was game in trying to establish that there are certain kinds of education and rules established by pimps to control how pimps do the work of pimps. But it totally fails. No higher education, there isn't really a specialized expertise involved. You're really just controlling access to sex workers and sometimes committing acts of violence, either allegedly to protect these sex workers or sometimes against them. I don't know that that's serving the public good at all. Here's another problem. Anything that is actually illegal to do, like being a pimp, doesn't count for our definition of professions. I know, it's weird. It was an amusing paper. I'll repeat myself. Strange dude. So we have to take pimp off the list. We have to take pro athlete off the list. Police officer is weird. I'll say that's a little iffy. K through 12 teachers are weird too. Those other four, I think, are really solid. But K through 12 teachers and police officers don't have as strong a claim to being professions as medical doctors, attorneys, nurses, accountants. So I think that this list of ideas is really important to keep in mind throughout the semester. Don't lose track of this idea. Students do very often. It frustrates me a little bit, but it's really the student's problem because this is something that I need to drill into you, and I think I do pretty well. Professions require specialized expertise. It's usually developed through higher education. It's organized. There is a group that controls what that body of knowledge is supposed to be. They have a commitment to use their expert knowledge in service to the public good, not directly for their own good, but for the sake of serving the public. The public has a need. These people are the only people that can fulfill that need. And that's why we go to them. They also have stronger claims than most to independence and self-regulation of their work. And they do have a certain degree of monopoly over service. Other people just can't do the work for them. In some of these instances, they can't legally do the work for them. In other instances, there's no way that just a member of the general public would have the knowledge and the understanding to be able to do it in any way like a professional does it. Another way to talk about professionalism is to recognize that all of these defining ideas form an ideology of what a profession is. Now, an ideology, I usually pronounce it ideology, is a set of beliefs that a group proposes to be reality. It's a set of beliefs about reality that this group is proposing is reality. And understanding professionalism as an ideology reminds us that they have a claim to expertise, not necessarily that they are expert. They have a claim to use their expertise to serve the public, not necessarily that they do use their expertise to serve the public. They have a claim to be self-regulating. They have a claim to have a monopoly over their service, and they have a claim to uphold a code of ethics. Now, remember, this is at the level of the whole profession. There are some doubts that some writers in professional ethics have about this whole idea of professionalism. But short of that, we also know that professions get bad reputations because the public can sometimes have doubts that they actually are served by the profession in question and may think of that profession as harming the public. Attorneys have a public image problem, I'll call it, in that regard. So that's a profession. What's professional ethics? First of all, it's this general notion that professions or professionals have particular responsibilities because of what they are, because they are professions or professionals. In other words, they have responsibilities other people don't have. Professional ethics also refers to specific, detailed, explicit statements of those responsibilities, and that is almost always by the professionals through their associations. And then professional ethics also refers to philosophical and sometimes sociological discussion of those first two. So what does it all mean? If you accept the idea that there is professional work that's different from other kinds of work, then the first of these ideas here is that because their work is different, it's specialized, it's expert knowledge based, it's intended to serve the public good, because it's a special kind of work in all those ways, members of the profession have a different set of responsibilities than people who are not members of that profession. A simple example of that is the idea that doctors are required to lend aid in the event of someone having a medical emergency. I'm not required to do that because I don't have any expertise regarding it. Maybe if they had a philosophical emergency, I would be able, or I would have a claim to necessarily providing my service to help them out of that. I don't know what a philosophical emergency would be. And neither do you. The second idea is that there are codes of ethics, basically, that the profession as a whole comes up with. Sometimes very deliberately, in fact, like they have conventions where people argue back and forth about minute little elements of their codes of ethics. That does happen, especially with lawyers. Why do we need professional ethics? First, let's break down this question. Why does it make any sense to explain anything in the world through ideas like professionalism or professional ethics? I think it's because although it is ideological, the set of ideas that says that professionals claim to have expert knowledge that no one else has, the claim that they serve the public through the use of their knowledge, the claim that they are self-regulating, the claim that they hold a monopoly over service, it holds up to a certain degree, to a great degree in many instances. And so having something like professionalism or professional ethics as a concept makes sense, I think, of the difference between their work and other kinds of work. And it makes sense of the special responsibilities that they have. That's my sense of why those ideas are useful. Another question is what these ideas do to help us identify or pick out what's important in a particular situation. One reason why professional ethics might come up is if someone served by a professional, generally speaking, that you'd call that person a client or a patient or a student. If a client or patient or student believes that the professional serving their need has done something wrong, then ideas like professional ethics would help you identify what went wrong. So, pretty frequently in professional ethics, people write about when things go wrong. So, there's a kind of bad news sort of quality to a lot of the writing in this field. So, we need professional ethics to explain the responsibilities that are unique to professions and inherent to the professions. In other words, only these professions have those responsibilities, and they have them because of the professions they are. Another reason is to explain the difference between ethical responsibilities of professions and general ethical responsibility that people might have. So let's go back to the idea of lending medical help in the event of someone with a medical emergency. The difference between a physician, a medical doctor, and somebody else in a situation like that is very important. And professional ethics helps explain the difference between those responsibilities. Let's say someone is having chest pains during a flight, right? They're in the air, they're flying from, let's say, San Francisco to New York. And some passenger develops chest pains, rings for the flight attendant and says, I've got chest pains. Well, a doctor and possibly even a nurse on board would have a professional responsibility to lend assistance in that case. Members of the general public wouldn't. Maybe you could say that members of the general public have an ethical responsibility of some kind to a person who's in trouble like that, but it's vague. It's not linked to some status that they have because they're just general members of the public. They're just a person, right? But a member of the profession of medicine has to look at the situation differently in terms of their responsibility as a medical professional. Another important thing is that professional ethics helps explain the difference between the ethical values that belong to the profession versus belong to the individual. So, medical doctors would still be people. And as people, as individuals, They may even disagree with some of the principles of the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics. They might think that something is wrong with the AMA's Code of Ethics. As a medical doctor, their general ethical responsibility is to follow that code, even if as an individual they disagree with it. So there can be conflict between a person's ethical values as an individual and those that they are required to follow out as a member of the profession. I think that's probably not going to happen very often. Most people that enter professions have to do so after a very, very long, arduous process of developing and learning and so forth. If you don't believe in the values of the profession, it would be really strange for you to continue on that path. So I think that the ethical values of the profession and those of an individual would tend to be at least congruent enough that the individual would not be thinking that they were violating their own values by being a member of the profession. So this is sort of summary. Professional work is supposed to be different from ordinary work because of its ethical responsibility, its special ethical responsibility. Because professional work is specialized, so too their ethical responsibility is specialized. Thirdly, professionals are supposed to be doing good for the public rather than acting only on self-interest, including moral self-interest. I'm going to give you an example of this that might strike you as odd, but I said something that might throw you a little bit. The difference between ethical values belonging to the profession and those belonging to an individual. This is a situation that happened with me. It happened only one time. And then I realized that I had made a mistake. Um, as an individual, not as a philosopher, just as a person, I happen to be a strong opponent of capital punishment. I don't need to go into the reasons why. It's not relevant to this explanation. It's just my belief. I think it's wrong for the state to execute prisoners, even murderers. As a member of my profession, I once taught a moral issues class using a book that had essays in it about capital punishment. These were essays arguing in favor of it and against it from various points of view, using various ethical theories. As a member of my profession, as a philosophy instructor, my responsibility and the values that I hold should be to be objective about these arguments, talk about which arguments are good and not good, what the problems are with the arguments, help the students understand the points of view and the underlying assumptions of those points of view, and maybe to think deeply about their own values. But because I have an individual moral belief that I hold very strongly about the issue, there was a kind of conflict. This conflict is called conflict of interest, by the way, and it's a major problem in professional ethics that we will talk about later in the semester. So I developed this conflict between the value belonging to my profession, disinterested examination of reasoning and ideas, and the values of myself as an individual, the firm belief that capital punishment is wrong. It was a big problem for me to use those essays in teaching that class. And I will never repeat it because I realized very early on how difficult it was for me to maintain my professional values of disinterest, objectivity, when students agreed with arguments that I don't agree with. It would be acting on my own self-interest rather than doing what's good for the public, if I criticized only those arguments for capital punishment. For instance, I didn't do that, but it was difficult for me just because it was, I don't know, kind of painful, and it was difficult to make sure I was acting objectively the way I should act as a professor. If I had not done that, I would be acting out of self interest rather than the good of the public, in this case, my students. I hope that example makes sense. It's a very minor thing. Nobody's life is at stake in how I teach a moral issues class, but it's still important in terms of my serving the public using my expertise. Finally, this seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how often what people say about professional ethics does end up kind of meaning this. Go be good. That's not clear advice. It doesn't tell us anything. So that's a kind of introduction to what we mean by professional ethics, what we mean by professions, and so forth. And I hope that that helps you.